Good morning, patrons. Rob Caskie, proudly telling stories. Thanks to a request from some of my listeners, I decided today that I would try to share with you some of the differences between the Arctic in the north and the Antarctic down in the south. I'm always intrigued by visitors who at times think that they're going to see polar bears down in Antarctica or they're going to see penguins up in the Arctic. And there are major differences between these two polar regions, very diversified in many ways, similar in others. And I'm hoping that you will enjoy a brief little summary of some of the primary differences between the Arctic and the Antarctic. The Arctic really is an ocean surrounded by vast land masses up in the north of the globe. The Antarctic is an enormous continent, a land mass surrounded by ocean, the seventh largest continent on Earth. The Arctic, by virtue of being a frozen ocean for much of its life and the year, really is pretty flat. The average height of the sea ice above sea level is a meter to perhaps 1.8 meters, so 3 to 6 feet above sea level, whereas Antarctica is the highest, driest, windiest, coldest continent on Earth. There are mountains in Antarctica that rise up to 15,000 feet above sea level, 5,000 feet higher than the top of our Drakensberg. And the South Pole is about 10,000 feet, nearly 10,000 feet above sea level, whereas the North Pole is literally 3 feet above sea level, the top of the sea ice on a constantly moving pack of ice. It would be fair to say this, that the North Pole, the closest land is probably northern Greenland or Ellesmere Island, about 700 kilometers away. From the South Pole to the edge of the Antarctic continent is a distance of more than 1,300 kilometers. So I would like here, just for some interest's sake, to have a look at a map of both of these magnificent polar regions. Here on the left, we have Antarctica. Down here, we have the mighty Ross Sea with the Ross Ice Shelf, the continental edge that is closest to the South Pole, this black dot in the middle of the map. And that region of Antarctica is accessed most easily from New Zealand. The part of Antarctica that most visitors visit and travel to regularly is the Antarctic Peninsula, this piece or finger of land that runs up towards South America, South Georgia, and the Falkland Islands, which in fact gives space for the Weddell Sea between the Antarctic Peninsula and the Antarctic mainland. It would be fair to point out at this stage that around Antarctica, running in a clockwise direction, is the Antarctic Circumpolar Current, the largest ocean current on Earth. Vast mass of water moving around the continent in a clockwise direction that produces in its own way a huge clockwise directional current in the Weddell Sea, and that current had huge effect on Shackleton and his ship, the Endurance, on the Endurance expedition, stories I have already shared. And this huge circumpolar current flowing around Antarctica tends to insulate the weather and the weather patterns of Antarctica, creating generally colder temperatures in Antarctica than they are in the Arctic. Interesting too that the Greek word for the Arctic, Arctos, they then wanted the opposite of the Arctic or Arctos at the southern end of the globe, so it was called Antarctos, hence the Arctic and Antarctica. So here on the other side of this map, we have the Arctic. This is a vast ocean surrounded by land masses. You may be interested to note that the Arctic has 36,000 recorded islands. The biggest, of course, is Greenland, the largest island on Earth. This little prick of land, Iceland, down below, the land that so many folks want to visit, Baffin Island, on the edge here of the Canadian Arctic, one of the most beautiful places I've ever visited. Here we've got the Canada mainland, the Canadian Arctic and Alaska, running of course up to the Bering Strait, this little narrows between Alaska and Russia. Much of this side of Russia is Siberia, hence the cold temperatures and the very, very inhospitable times on that side of the Arctic Ocean. I hope you recall my story about the Alaskan-Canadian Highway, built in 1942 to link the lower 48, the lower United States, through Canada with Alaska, and across the Bering Strait with the ally at the time, Russia, after the Japanese warplanes had bombed the American fleet in Pearl Harbor. And then down here we've got Nova Zelemia, Franz Joseph Land and so forth, Lapland running down to the top edges of Norway and those wonderful Scandinavian countries. So generally speaking, we have the Arctic being an ocean surrounded by land masses, the Antarctic, a huge land mass surrounded by ocean, creating their own differences in climate and temperature as a result. You might be interested to note that in Antarctica, there's ice that runs to 4,000 meters, 4 kilometers deep, 2.5 miles deep. The coldest recorded temperature at one of the Russian stations in 1983 was minus 90 degrees centigrade. That is impossible for me to describe to you. Some folks say once you get below minus 20 degrees centigrade, it's literally impossible to decipher the differences in temperature from then onwards. Very hard for us to imagine temperatures of minus 90 degrees centigrade. You may recall in the great conflicts when the Germans invaded Russia, where tank axles were literally snapping on account of the cold and metal being buckled when run and started in those frigid temperatures. So let's have a look now at some of the important features in terms of vegetation, wildlife, and so forth. Besides the most obvious difference, penguins in the Arctic, penguins, see how easy it is to be confused. Penguins in the Antarctic and polar bears in the Arctic. The largest land animal officially in Antarctica is a wingless midge, tiny little creature, only a few millimeters long. Having said that, Antarctica hosts vast populations of wildlife that move down there, particularly in the summer, to feed on the enormous krill populations, these tiny crustaceans that aggregate in enormous blooms down in the Southern Ocean and the Antarctic seas. The crab-eater seal is the second most numerous mammal on Earth behind the human being. You may be interested to note too that the elephant seal, the big males, those beach masters that have the rights to most of the breeding, can weigh up to 4,500 kilograms, and they come onto the land for breeding purposes and spend much time on the beaches of South Georgia and Antarctica, making them the second largest land mammal on Earth behind an elephant. And of course, there are always the whales that move down into Antarctica for the feeding, and these vast numbers of penguins, almost no vegetation. There are some lichens and some mosses and some tiny, tiny little plants that grow in the warmer regions of the Antarctic Peninsula. Whereas in the Arctic, you have far more shrubs, grass on the tundra, and some trees. Interesting to note that the tundra, or the taiga as it is often called in the Arctic, 11.5 million square kilometers is the largest biome on Earth. So the tundra is very important. Unfortunately, because the Arctic, by nature of the land masses surrounding it, is very flat and gently undulating, predominantly prescribed by tundra or this taiga environment, it can be at times perhaps a little monotonous to those visiting by way of a cruise ship. And I always say to folks that if you want to visit the Arctic, you need to take a real interest in the sociology and the human history of the area. Between the Inuits and the Sami people, the Laplanders, the Athabascans, and all those incredible folks on the Siberian side of the Arctic Ocean, the social history of the Arctic is enormously interesting. These folks have made special provision and adaptations to survive in that frigid environment. Bearing in mind that the year-round calendar generally involves 5 months of darkness, a month of twilight, 5 months of light, a month of twilight, and then that 12-month cycle begins again, whether you are in the Arctic or the Antarctic. Very importantly, the South Pole was first reached by Roald Amundsen, you recall, on the 14th of December of 1911. Interesting that it was he, that remarkable Norwegian explorer, who was first through the Northwest Passage in 1903, 04, 05, 1906 on his little vessel called the Joa. Only 47 tons it weighed, with a small crew, a really incredible journey, and first through the fabled Northwest Passage. It was that same man, Amundsen, who would be first to fly in literally a hot air balloon with a madcap Italian, Umberto Nobile, over the North Pole in 1925. But it was only in the 1950s that a quite remarkable man, Wally Herbert, was first across the sea ice and the pack ice to reach the North Pole on foot or by the ice route, so to speak. Many had tried before him, some had got close, none of them had succeeded, including that extraordinary neurosurgeon Fridtjof Nansen, remarkable Norwegian. So I hope that this has given you a little bit of insight into the differences between these two magnificent polar regions that dominate the north and the south of our globe, along with the north and south geographic pole. There are also the north and south magnetic poles. The south magnetic pole was first reached by David Mawson and Mackay off the Nimrod in 1909, that incredible expedition led by Ernest Shackleton. It was James Clark Ross who first located accurately the North Magnetic Pole. And I'm hoping that this has piqued your interest to read a little more perhaps about the Arctic versus the Antarctic, and perhaps you have the interest, the time and the resource one day to visit one or perhaps both of these quite staggering polar regions on our globe. Thank you very much.